So On One Foot is a virtual learning series that features a different Jewish faculty member from the University of Memphis or Rhodes College every other week to spotlight the incredible Jewish intellectual talent we have here in Memphis for the entire Memphis community to enjoy. Each guest speaker is encouraged to discuss what their academic area of expertise can teach us about navigating life's challenges today, as well as share about their own Jewish journey. Our guest lecturer today is Professor Victor Coonin. Professor Coonin is an active scholar specializing in the field of Italian Renaissance art. He's authored 2 books, edited or co-edited 4 volumes of essays, and published dozens of articles, museum catalog entries, and book reviews. His book on Michelangelo's David appeared in 2014 and was cited in the New York Times as the definitive recent history of the statue. It was also the answer to a question posed on the TV show Jeopardy! Yeah. Professor Coonin teaches art and art history at Rhodes College and serves on the Rhodes Hillel Advisory Council. He also is one of the most important mentors of my daughter and Rhodes alumna, Rachel, who graduated in 2018. Thank you, Professor Coonin, for helping Hillel launch this exciting new and enlightening series. I would also like to introduce Sophie Block, the very dynamic executive director of Hillels of Memphis and creator of this unique program. Sophie will serve as today's MC.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you, Professor Coonin, for being our guinea pig as we launch this series. We're so excited to have you as our first speaker. When I was thinking about this semester and what it means to start a semester online, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to highlight our Jewish faculty at both Rhodes and University of Memphis and other Memphis schools, and take advantage of everyone being on computers all day, and really emphasize the academic talent we have here in Memphis, the Jewish academic talent we have. So with that, I would love for Professor Coonin to start his lecture, and then I have some questions for afterward. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end. Please do keep track of your questions. You can put them in the chat box for us to refer back to if you need a place to store them. And I'm excited to hear what Professor Victor Coonin has for us today. Thank you.
Well, good. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Sophie. This is a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm very grateful. When Sophie first presented the opportunity to me, though, I was a little bit like a deer caught in the headlights. I didn't know what I would talk about, especially with so many momentous things going on in the world, such as COVID and Black Lives Matter and et cetera. And then I thought, well, let's talk about that and do so with maybe some framework from my area of specialty, which is the Italian Renaissance, and in particular, Michelangelo. And this is something that I try to do regularly in all of my classes, to make the subject material of the past seem particularly relevant to the present, and maybe help us with some guides for the future. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin. And you know, it might not seem self-evident, but I think that there's actually a nice relationship to be discussed between something like the historical figure of Moses, sculpted by Michelangelo in the 16th century, and a monument such as the one that at least Memphians will be familiar with as a statue commemorating General Forrest, and that has since been removed. And before that took place, of course, the graffiti here that you see of Black Lives Matter. So somebody has clearly made that connection in the present context, and I hope to make that even stronger. So I'm going to start off with a picture that's actually not by Michelangelo, it's by the painter Botticelli here in the 15th century. And the reason I'm starting with this is that it tells a story, or an episode of a story that is found in the book known as the Decameron by the author Boccaccio. And what's interesting to me about that is the the book was written in the context of a pandemic. It was the bubonic plague or Black Death of 1348. And the story basically takes as its premise that you have 10 individuals who fear the plague in Florence, and so they escape to the countryside to effectively quarantine themselves. And they do this for 2 weeks, which isn't very different from our present day quarantine recommendations. And excluding the feast days or weekend days, you have 10 days over those 2 weeks and 10 individuals. And so the 10 individuals each tell a story each day, and you wind up with 100 stories, and that makes up the Decameron. And the main point that I just want to make with this is that it's during these periods of crisis, in both of these cases of sickness and disease, that we tell stories. We re-look at our narratives. We look again at the stories that we tell and what we're doing with those stories. And that's what we're doing today. And I think that that's one of the reasons why movements such as Black Lives Matter has become so powerful, because we're all in the midst of reevaluating who we are and what are we doing, and taking new stock of our stories. So I'm going to focus the first part of my talk on Michelangelo's Moses. And I've been told to keep it relatively short to allow time afterwards for some reflections on Jewish journeys and some questions and answer periods that we might enjoy. So I'm just going to start off with a few questions. And I know that whenever you put up a PowerPoint with words, everyone just starts reading it. So why don't we just read it together? Some basic questions. Why does Moses have horns? Was Michelangelo anti-Semitic? How did Jews react to the statue over time? Would a Jewish artist have designed the Moses differently? How does the meaning of the statue change from the original context to the current context? And what do we do with the statue now, knowing what it is that we know and having changed in the ways that society has changed? And then can we bring this to bear on some contemporary situations today? So let's go ahead and start and just very briefly establish a little bit of context. One of the important things to note is that Michelangelo's Moses was never intended to be seen as an isolated figure. It was actually begun for a pope named Julius II. He was from the Della Rovere family. And in 1505, Michelangelo comes up with a concept for the tomb of the Pope. The tomb is originally supposed to go in the middle of St. Peter's Cathedral, which is still under construction. And this is just a hypothetical reconstruction of what Michelangelo had in mind, a huge freestanding monument with lots of sculptures at the base, a few sculptures at the upper story, and then a tomb here, or at least a facsimile of a tomb for Pope Julius II. And one of these figures at the top would have been Moses, but it would have been one of at least 4 figures at the top and one of dozens and dozens of figures around the tomb. So what happens is that Michelangelo gets in a fight with Julius II, and the outcome of that, to make a long story short, is that the Pope forces Michelangelo to paint a certain ceiling, and that is what we know as the Sistine ceiling. But while he's doing that, the tomb project is being delayed, and it's going to be what Michelangelo considers to be this tragic circumstance that he can never quite get back to the tomb and make it like he wants it. Eventually, Pope Julius II dies before Michelangelo gets very far on that tomb project, and the succeeding popes and heirs of the Pope have to accommodate a whittled down design that in fact doesn't go into St. Peter's at all. So it was supposed to go into this building on the left, which is at the center of Christendom, and ends up here in this rather small church known as San Pietro in Vincoli, which translates to St. Peter in chains. And there you have what we presume to be the chains that St. Peter wore when he was imprisoned. So it goes into a different context, a lesser church, if you will, but also a lesser display, whereby, in effect, Moses becomes the focal point rather than just one of many figures on this tomb. And in fact, nobody really goes into the church today to see the other figures surrounding the Moses, most of which are controversial as to whether Michelangelo had much of a hand in designing and or carving the figures at all. But nobody doubts that Michelangelo carved the Moses figure, and that is the main reason to observe this monument, this one figure that was intended as part of an entire ensemble. So let's just jump to the horns. Why does Moses have horns? I am not a biblical scholar. I've checked this with a biblical scholar to make sure that it's at least not too inaccurate. But basically what you have is in the 4th century, St. Jerome translating the Hebrew Bible from Hebrew. What he does is he translates into Latin this phrase, Karan Pene, as horns around Moses, when he probably knows, almost certainly knows, that a better, more accurate translation would be rays of light that are surrounding the head or face of Moses. And this really becomes the basis of why Jews throughout history have been represented with horns. Even if Jerome didn't know it when he translated it, it was quickly, immediately known to just about everyone else in the church that the translation could have gone a different way, and it stuck. So this was a slight. This was a slur on Moses and the Jews. Now, did Michelangelo know all of this? Was he familiar with this history? Perhaps vaguely. There is no letter or document or any other piece of evidence of Michelangelo himself commenting on what he thought of the Jewish people, Jews in general. So we really don't know. But we do see that Michelangelo followed a certain tradition, which begs a couple of questions. So first of all, how long is this tradition? Well, it's pretty long. It's pretty old, representing Jews with horns. I just wanted to find something that was fairly early, and this is a nice example because you can see very clearly in this English Psalter from somewhere in the early 13th century, you have Moses depicted with these horns, and then a representation of Christ as God appearing in the burning bush. So certainly in Christian manuscripts, in Christian art in general, you had a tradition of showing Moses with horns. Here as a contrast, you have a representation of Moses parting the Red Sea. And the interesting thing about this image is, A, it comes from a Jewish Haggadah, and B, there are no horns. So you do have alternate traditions to the representation of Moses, and particularly here in Jewish manuscripts, you do not have Moses depicted with horns. But that's not to say that all Christian art showed Moses with horns either. So what you have is a bit of variety within art. This is a picture that Michelangelo, without question, would have been intimately familiar with, because it's actually in the Sistine Chapel. So he would have seen this every day between about 1508 and 1512. It's a picture by an artist named Perugino, who during his lifetime was one of the most famous artists of his day, perhaps a little bit more famous today for being the teacher of Raphael, and someone who Michelangelo would have studied and admired without question. And what you have is a rather complicated scene that shows Moses 3 times. This is fairly typical of medieval and some Renaissance narratives to show the story continuing through the picture. But the reason it's nice for us is to show you that Perugino didn't make a mistake here. He deliberately shows Moses 3 times, and in none of those 3 images does Moses have horns. And therefore, Michelangelo is no doubt familiar with a couple of different ways to depict Moses. He can depict him with horns, or he can depict him without horns, and chooses to depict him with horns. Now, did Michelangelo have free choice on this? Well, it's unclear exactly during which years he's sculpting this monument. Let's say, for the sake of argument, many scholars think around 1515 would be a nice approximate date for him to have begun. And at that point, Michelangelo is a fairly well-established artist. He's done the David, he's done the Pietà, he's done the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He has some clout. He can't simply do whatever he wants all the time, but he has a lot of leeway here. And so there probably is an element of choice. Michelangelo choosing to depict Moses with those horns. And the statue isn't installed, though, until much later. It basically sits in storage in Michelangelo's house and workshop for decades until it's actually installed. But once it is installed, it does seem to have caused a sensation, such that not only Christians visiting the church viewed the statue, but Jews as well. We have an authority from Michelangelo's lifetime, somebody who knew Michelangelo well. His name is Giorgio Vasari. He wrote a famous series of biographies of artists that culminates in the being of Michelangelo. Now, Vasari's not always tremendously accurate, and sometimes he'll make stuff up when it suits his purpose. But he's probably playing it fairly straight here, where he says, well, may the Hebrews continue to go there, as they do every Sabbath, both men and women, like flocks of starlings, to visit and adore that statue, for they will be adoring a thing not human, but divine. So on the one hand, what Vasari is doing is trying to extol the virtues of the statue. But on the other hand, people would have known if he was lying or not, that Jews came to see this statue. And he almost certainly did not just make this up. Now, to be sure, Jews weren't always allowed free access to visit churches. And so sometimes there were bans and sometimes there weren't, and you could always get around bans by doing things like claiming that you wanted conversion, and so you needed to get into the church, or you wanted to be baptized or something. But I think really a better analogy would be to speed limits. You know, the speed limit says you can only go 55, but we all know people are flying at 70 down the highway. And unless you get caught, there's no record of you actually surpassing the speed limit, right? So it's a little bit like that. If you didn't get caught and you were a Jew who wanted to go and see the Moses, it was probably perfectly fine. And it's not as if this was policed heavily at the door. So it was always probably pretty accurate there. And we know from other records in following centuries that Jews did come to see the statue. So despite the horns, the statue becomes something that we know is admired within the Christian community, but also becomes an admired statue within the Jewish community. So in that sense was embraced, even if there were certain imperfections. So obviously the presence of the horns is something that would not have been desirable to the Jewish community. And it would have been well known that the horns implied certain associations, especially with the devil. And here's a particularly noxious cartoon that is of a modern sort, but really follows the medieval stereotype of associating the Jews with the devil, the Jews with death, the Jews with causing bad things like plagues or whatever else you want to blame on somebody, right? The Jews become a convenient scapegoat. That's no great news here. And even in modern times, of course, I remember my grandparents telling me that when Christian kids wanted to rile them or make fun of them, they would say, "Show us your horns, show us your horns," right? As a way to insult Jews. So that tradition is old, and it carries on through many centuries. So let's get back to those original questions. You know, why does Moses have horns? Well, he has the horns because Michelangelo is following one of several traditions in how to depict Moses. And one of those traditions goes back and claims a certain authority from no less a figure than Saint Jerome. Was Michelangelo anti-Semitic? It's a tough one to answer. Not outwardly, and he probably would not have thought of himself as anti-Semitic, but he has created a stereotype here that perpetuates anti-Semitic attitudes. And it's one of those things that we can ask ourselves today, right? To what extent are we perpetuating certain stereotypes and certain attitudes while claiming not to be X-ist, right? And still playing a role in having those biases continue. How did Jews react to the statue over time? It seemed fairly positively, but would a Jewish artist have designed it differently? Absolutely. A Jewish artist would not have put the horns there. And so a Jewish audience didn't appreciate the horns, but there was, in effect, nothing they could do about it. And so, in effect, embraced the rest of the figure. The meaning changing over time is interesting because what had been begun as part of a funerary monument to Julius II really took on a life of its own. I dare say that if Michelangelo had created the monument as he wanted, we would still be talking about the Moses, but it wouldn't have the fame that it enjoys today. In fact, in the 19th century, you could argue that the Moses was the single most famous work by Michelangelo. It's probably eclipsed today by Michelangelo's David, and maybe by the Pietà. But still, if there's a number 3 on the greatest hits list, it would be the Moses by Michelangelo. And so context has certainly changed the way that we've reacted to it over time. But what do we do with the statue now? This is a tough one in the case of Michelangelo's Moses, but I do think that the more we inform ourselves about the statue, the richer our questions and answers become. I think that there should be didactics near the statue explaining why there are horns. I think we should talk about it in all of our classes, as I do, right? About why it has horns. I don't think that it's something to ignore. I think it's something to face, to confront. And I wish that we actually talked more about Moses's horns rather than less about Moses's horns, because it's a question that's asked time and time again by my students. And I wish they wouldn't have to ask it, but I'm glad that they do. And so it gives us an opportunity to discuss it. So to sort of close the discussion, what are some analogous situations today? I've chosen just one, and it's this one here. It's a monument that might not be as well known as others, but it's becoming more and more controversial. So what you have, I've just given you some excerpts from Wikipedia since it's convenient and fairly accurate here, is a memorial known as the Emancipation Memorial. And the iconography or the symbolism here is rich in both positive and negative ways. Ostensibly, what you have is a statue that is showing Lincoln with the right hand holding the Emancipation Proclamation, and then a slave at his feet who's being unshackled. It was paid for by freed slaves. And yet, what else do you have here? Well, you have a white man standing over a black man, and a black man being freed due to the efforts of the white man. And you have one man in a subservient position to another who's in a position of power. And we can ask these same questions that we asked about the Moses, just substituting a few terms. Why does Moses have horns? Why does the black man kneel before the white man? Was Michelangelo anti-Semitic? Was the commission racist? Well, yeah, the commission is racist, especially as we better understand it today. How did Jews react to Moses? Well, how do blacks react to this statue? The Jews just had to take it with the Moses statue. Now maybe we can talk about it a little bit more. Blacks, I think, have had to take it. And now they can question it, right? Now everyone can question it, not just blacks, right? Now we can all question it, as we're doing today. And we can ask, is this proper as a monument? Is this appropriate? And if we feel different about it now than people did earlier, what should we do about it? Would a black artist have done it differently? Absolutely, no question. So what do we do? I don't think that we should destroy these monuments, but in many cases, I do think that we should move them and change their context, and by recontextualizing them, maybe change the world a little bit. And I'm not the only one who feels that way, because you can see here that a copy has existed for many years in Boston. And this is just a headline that I copied. The Boston Art Commission voted unanimously to remove their copy of the Emancipation Memorial recently for these very reasons. In effect, it's racist propaganda right there in the middle of the city of Boston, and we still have similar propaganda, well, the same propaganda in the middle of Washington. So these are things that need to be talked about. These are things that we need to teach to our students, teach to others, and questions, I think, important ones that they all raise. Ultimately, it's about reassessing our history and as well our future. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to go in the face of Black Lives Matter? How do we want to reassess monuments that might be overtly or maybe implicitly racist? Monuments that might be overtly or implicitly anti-Semitic or sexist, right? Or elitist, or whatever the case may be. I'm not saying that all of them need to come down, but they all need to be constantly reevaluated and reassessed. And maybe some of them come down. Maybe some of them get moved. Maybe some of them gain more didactic material. Maybe some have other statues that are put up in conversation with them. There are things that we can do. We don't have to let things just simply sit there. And in that sense, it's an exciting moment of opportunity within the arts as we determine what our artistic future is going to look like. So I think that, Sophie, I will end my comments and give it to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel so inspired, and it's been since I was in college that I've felt this excited about diving into a new subject. So thank you for sharing. My first question, before we get into you and your story, while the content that you shared is fresh, I'd love to maybe ask some questions about that first. What role does art play in documenting life? And then how does art impact how we remember the past? Or in other words, at what point does life start to resemble art instead of art resembling life? Kind of a big one, but.
Yeah, it's a great question. In some ways, I could talk from now until January about it, I suppose. But you all don't want to hear me droning on like that. It's a matter of recognizing that art is a significant part of our daily lives and of our history. And just as we're constantly reassessing the way we talk with each other, the way we use our body language, the way we write things, the way we communicate, art is part of that. And so the more we recognize that, you know, walking down the street and seeing a statue or seeing a painting, that it means something, it's not just decoration. I think the more that we're communicating the way we're really supposed to communicate it as human beings. So I'll leave that as a really short answer, but if anybody else wants to chime in or add anything to that, I'd be happy.
Thank you. I'm also wondering, well, art, your lecture has illuminated and emphasized that art has a lot of room for misrepresentation or also misinterpretation. And how do we reconcile the subjective self-expression that art enables us to have with that potential for future misrepresentation, like, or misinterpretation, like the horns on Moses?
Right. So that also gets into a lot of controversial situations. You know, context is everything. The way that you present words, the way that you present images, the way that you present yourself, it's always meaningful, and sometimes more meaningful than less. I'm not trying to dodge the question in any way. I'm just trying to indicate that artwork is always being reassessed. It's one of the things that I emphasize to my students time and again. You know, I wrote a book about Donatello. I want them to write the next book about Donatello and to talk about things that I never thought to talk about, and to realize things that I never realized about his person or his sculptures. It's a cliche that every generation needs to reinterpret the past, but it's also a truth that I deeply believe in, because we're operating under a different set of experiences and assumptions and biases and information. And so the world has to change, and our assumptions and biases, et cetera, need to change with that. And it's only by looking at things and not being afraid to ask questions that we grow. And that's really what art is about in the end. You know, art is always, you know, again, we have these cliches about pushing the envelope, or, you know, doing things that are new, or trying to be subversive, or whatever it is. You know, we're really just trying to ask new sets of questions, because nobody ever knows the answers to all these questions. So I love it when I see an artwork that I don't understand, and someone needs to explain it to me, and I learn about a conversation that I never even knew existed. Right? That has become, I think, more and more true for all of us as we face movements such as Black Lives Matter, where the nature of the conversation is what's changing. It wasn't as if there never was a conversation. There's always been a conversation, but it's the nature of that conversation which is different now. And so I think that that's really important, to be willing to engage and to change and to acknowledge things that you weren't talking about, or that you were talking about differently, or from a standpoint of you know, imperfect understanding or sympathy. Right? So this is a really exciting moment in academia. It's a really scary moment in academia, because one doesn't know what to talk about all the time, and certain conversations can dominate other conversations. But that's also an exciting moment, because it means that there's the possibility for change, and you can do your part to try to make sure that that change is going to happen for the better. So, you know, again, using something like Michelangelo's Moses, if I can get my students and all of you to think a little bit differently about Black Lives Matter, that's a win. That's a win in my book.
Thank you. Something that I think about a lot and have been thinking about since COVID happened, once COVID kicked off in March, it's something my husband and I talk a lot about is, you know, in spite of everything going on in this extraordinary and unprecedented time we're living in, there must be such amazing art that's in the process of emerging now. That so much of the prolific artwork of the past has come from times in history where there is extreme social, socioeconomic, political change. And so I'm curious if you've thought about that, about the art of the future that's being kind of marinated and developed in the minds and souls of artists everywhere today.
Yeah, there's no question that a few years from now, we're going to be having these retrospective art exhibits about art made during the age of quarantine and art reflecting on the age of quarantine. There's just simply no question about that. But one of the things that I've been impressed with also is that when all of this hit, all you heard about were you know, the cries of, you know, the museum needs to close, or an artist can't exhibit their work, et cetera. And I'm completely sympathetic to that. I'm not trying to take away from that at all. But then the flip side of that is you sit back and say, all right, well, how can we make a different type of exhibit happen? And how can I show my art in a different way? Or how can I create my art in a different way? And we're seeing that mushrooming in really interesting ways. Museums trying to do more intimate things with curator talks and you know, talks over coffee. Everyone brings their own coffee to their computer, right? But curators going through exhibits in a more leisurely way to try to introduce people to things that they can't normally see, or even exhibits that are now being presented online in ways that wouldn't have happened without the quarantine. So in other words, people getting creative during this period. That's not to say this doesn't all, I mean, it's bad. This is bad. I'm not saying this is a good thing. We're all suffering here, and the art's disproportionately suffering. But then people make music, as you've seen on TV, by splicing together different videos, right? And we've seen TV shows that are all these little boxes that we're looking at now. And who would have thought of that before the age of quarantine? And so we see creative possibilities that are emerging, and we will be different because of this. You know, I don't like teaching using Zoom. On the other hand, I see the utility of Zoom going forward, where maybe if I'm unable to come to class or students are unable to come to class, we can still have class, right? Or if I want a colleague from Italy to Zoom in and talk about something of their specialty, now it's possible, and it wasn't before because of the cost of getting them here, right? So there are certain possibilities that are now more evident. They might have been somewhat evident before, but now everybody can see that there are certain possibilities that we didn't have before. So you'll see it in lectures, you'll see it in museum exhibits, you'll see it in the way artists are making art. And then once we're out of quarantine, let's hope it's really, really soon, we'll see it as people reflect back upon this experience and start analyzing this experience. And I mean, there's going to be an explosion of scholarship studying the philosophy of quarantine, the psychology of quarantine, the social dynamics of quarantine, the art of quarantine. Right? This is all something to come, and it should be pretty interesting.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, with that, I'd love to open up the floor for other questions that might be burning in your minds. Feel free to take yourself off mute or raise your hand and I can take you off mute. Looks like Rachel is unmuted, and then Harry, I'll call on you next. Go for it, Rachel.
Professor Coonin, hello. I've missed you. We need to catch up soon. How often are you doing these? Because I will sit in every single one of these Zoom calls.
You're so sweet. I think this is the first and only one, but we'll see. I'm happy to Zoom with you.
We should do one again. But anyway, I do have a question. Would you say that it gets these types of conversations about removing statues, especially not necessarily recontextualizing them, but would you say that it gets dicier when you're talking about the specific artist? Like, we're talking about Michelangelo versus Thomas Ball. Not to knock Thomas Ball. Thomas Ball is a divine sculptor. He has wonderful reliefs. But then you have the aura that is Michelangelo and everything that he's done. And again, both I think certainly need didactics, and we need to have better teaching moments around both. But yeah, is it harder maybe to remove a Michelangelo versus a Thomas Ball?
It's both harder and easier. It's easier in the sense that everybody knows the name Michelangelo, and so you can get certain things done if you're invoking the name Michelangelo or Picasso or Rembrandt, right? That you can't if you're invoking the name of a lesser known artist. On the other hand, to make change is sometimes a little bit harder because people think that you're trying to knock Michelangelo off a pedestal. And that's really not the intent. The intent is to recontextualize Michelangelo. And so so it works a little bit both ways. My experience has been that it's actually hardest the more you get contemporary, which is one reason I specialized in artists who have been dead for at least 500 years, because they can't contradict you, right? They can't speak back. So I think that there are some really difficult conversations that go on today, over catchwords like cultural appropriation, or whether it is appropriate to have certain types of contemporary exhibits that are calling into question certain social conventions. I think that those are the conversations that lead to more heated debate. So in that sense, it's a little bit safer, where we can say, let's talk about the horns on Michelangelo's Moses, and people are willing to engage in those conversations because it's less likely that you'll get hurt, right? In those conversations. A little bit more difficult when you start talking about things as they become more contemporary. So I hope that answers your question, but nothing attracts attention like Michelangelo. So I think just somebody saying we're going to put didactics about Michelangelo's horns in that church might make the New York Times, right? Or some other major press, and that's positive. Even if it invokes controversy, that's positive because we need to be talking about it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks for the good question, Rachel. Harry, did you have a question? We have to unmute you first, and then the bottom left. There you go.
The depiction of Moses in Michelangelo's statue may or may not have been an indication of anti-Semitism on the part of Michelangelo. But the statue of Lincoln at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, I don't see how it could possibly be construed as being anti-Black. Perhaps the depiction of the Black person in a subservient position might be construed as that. But to me, they appear to have intrinsic differences. Aside from all this, my wife and I were able to visit that statue in the church one afternoon. We were the only ones in the church. It was wide open. And I thought, golly, how long is this statue going, a priceless statue, how long is it going to exist where people can come in and a lot of, create all kinds of mayhem with it if they wished? That seemed strange to me, but it's a beautiful statue.
It shows that he's...
So it's an interesting thing when you look at the power of visuals, the power of images. There's a lot of things that we don't consciously digest, but we are fed certain messages. So to be more specific, when we study ancient art, one of the easy ways that they had, we're talking about 2000 BCE, to show that an individual was more powerful, was that you took the king, you made the king bigger than everybody else in the scene. You knew who was the king, and you put them a little bit higher than everyone else. So the person who was biggest and tallest was most powerful. And if they had a really big head, then they were also wiser than everybody else. So use really, really basic imagery in order to establish a certain hierarchy and to establish who was more important. And these really basic techniques carry on throughout history. There are these famous images of Queen Victoria meeting people who are her supposed subjects, right? And especially when they are non-white, they're always depicted smaller than Queen Victoria because she's bigger and more powerful. So when you get to that monument with Lincoln, you have a white man standing over a black man, and the white man who in effect has the power to free or not free the black man, it sends a message that the black man needs the white man in order to be free, that the white man is the power figure, even under conditions of a freed former slave. So the messages seem to hearken back to these older types of representations. Who's more powerful? Who's more important? The one standing, the one bigger, the one taller. And therefore, subtly or not so subtly, sort of reinforces these notions of inferiority of the person who's bowing, in effect, or is down low. So that's one way that I think it's very fair to accuse that statue of being implicitly or explicitly racist in a way that maybe people who relate to the bowing down figure don't want to see that, or don't want to see it every day, or don't want to see it publicly, or don't want to see it as propaganda that's seen as okay in our nation's capital. So I have sympathy for that view.
Mhm.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Bernstein.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad to see Harry Samuels here, because in a couple of weeks I have reference making to his work, Beschert, and having to do with Jewish English. So that's just a comment. I do have a question about the horns on Michelangelo. I'm wondering, in the context of his day, if it might have been interpreted as something laudatory, that deities at some point were depicted with horns, that in contrast, David doesn't have horns just because he's Jewish. So I don't know that. I just was raising it as a possible topic. Is it possible that the horns are representing something that is honoring the Moses as Michelangelo might have depicted within the context of his time? And I think the same thing about art applies to literature in the context of the time. I'm thinking about the reappraisal of Huckleberry Finn, for example, and the language and so on in it that literary scholars have taken to. But so I'm really curious about how those horns might have been considered something not devilish, but more like God-like, or a demigod anyway.
Right. So the figure of Moses, Michelangelo is trying to depict in a positive manner. He's not trying in any way to say Moses is a bad guy. In fact, Moses is being depicted as a prophet and lawgiver. That's probably the main reason why Moses is one of the prophets chosen. So in that sense, Michelangelo is including him on the tomb of Julius II in an entirely positive manner. And Julius II even has various associations with Moses. So absolutely. But adding the horns would not have been necessarily positive as much as a way to mark out Moses as representing the old laws, the Mosaic laws, which have been supplanted by the new laws, the Christian laws, which are the better, truer laws. So in that sense, Moses is important and to be celebrated, but he's still Jewish and, for lack of a better term, a freak, right? A horned freak, even if he's, an ancestor of ours spiritually. So I don't think that there's a positive spin that he's trying to put on it. I think that he is choosing to follow a certain tradition of the horned Moses that is, marking him out as the other, right?
Any other questions? I see Bluma put in the chat box.
Yeah, it's a good point. So when you get to representing kings, emperors, etc., and the idea of there's a very ancient tradition that say an ancient Assyrian king would radiate light because he's allowed this divine revelation. And so Moses might have radiated light as divine revelation. And in many Christian manuscripts, Moses has a halo around his head. And that's where that whole idea of the halo comes from, is radiating the light. Now you do have the type of horned representation in ancient art where they're wearing a helmet that has bull's horns, and so the idea is that they have the power of the bull, or the king of the humans is even better than the king of the beasts, type of things, and you get these strange things where Alexander the Great, when he goes through Egypt, is going to take on the horns of Amun-Ra and have these associations with an Egyptian pharaoh and being the son of a sun god, type of thing. But by the time you get into Christian art and in the 16th century, the horns of Moses are really a fairly particular type of horn on a particular individual. And you generally do not find horns on other Jewish figures, other important Jewish figures. I can't think of any example of horns on David. So Michelangelo is following a Davidic tradition, and he's following a Mosaic tradition with Moses. I can't really see an argument for them being positive. That's my feeling on that.
Thank you. Maybe a last question in our remaining minutes? Anything burning on the top of someone's mind? Or any last words for us, Professor Coonin, in closing?
No, I just want to thank everyone for coming and actually giving me an audience today, and I hope that whatever I've been able to share has been thought-provoking. I don't ever presume that I'm saying the last word on something, and I love disagreement, and I love ambiguity, and I love being taught new things. So again, I just hope that this is the beginning, or that we're in the process of a conversation that will continue.